And for all those joining us from Europe or other time zones, good morning, or whatever the time zone is that you're in. Thank you for joining us in this second event in our series called SG Declares and Shares. We had one a couple of months ago, and then this is the second one, and then we have the next one would be in November. For those who may not know about the Construction Declares movement, it is a movement that started over a year ago in the UK and is now sort of spread across the globe. A number of architects, engineers, and other construction industry professionals have joined the movement, which declares that we do have a real issue with the environment and biodiversity. We think that around 500,000 people, professionals, work in the companies who have joined the declaration in this year or so, and the movement is obviously growing more and more, and we invite more and more people to get to know about the movement and to join. In terms of Singapore, we have architects, structural engineers, and environmental consultants who've joined the declaration. And very soon, we are hoping to be able to announce that our colleagues within the landscape architecture and design profession will have joined as well. Now, we have three prolific speakers in John, Stanislava, and Anna, and we have the inimitable Benjamin Towell as our moderator. And without further ado, I pass to Ben to introduce our speakers and to get the session going. Benjamin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Hussein. Yes, so today we're looking at ecology and cities, and it's going to be a rather whirlwind hour-long tour through the topic. Three wonderful speakers, three fantastic papers, and hopefully I'm able to hold it together in a moderated discussion at the end. Talking of that, there is a question and answer box. So those listening, please write down any questions that you may have, and we'll try and answer them as the discussion goes. It also saves me thinking up half an hour's worth of questions in one go. But without further ado, I think we should get straight onto it. So first up, we have Stanislava, who is an international award-winning architect and urban designer, and she's interested in research-led design activities, exploring the links between science, architecture, and cities. So 8 minutes, you'll see my head pop up, a minute to go, and that will be time to wrap up before we move on to the next paper. So Stanislava, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides. Please confirm. And well, it's a great pleasure being with you today, and thank you very much for the invite. And yes, I would like to speak about urban concerns and the questions related to environment and ecology from my point of view of architect and urban designer. And the first thing I would like to say that those concerns we are living now we are facing now go well beyond our own profession. And this is why the interdisciplinarity is the key to have an idea of the scale of the projects we are dealing with. And thinking about the city, as said well before me, as a symphony of natural and artificial, well, this is definitely the way we can see the city as the combination of natural elements and artificial elements. And thinking through this lens of ecology about the city, we can see that ecological design can actually give us this opportunity to see the multiple scales we are dealing with in taking design decisions in our cities. And also ecology gives us the opportunity to link a local city scale and the regional, more wide, broader scale, and rethink actually today, with the growing complexity of the city, rethink interactions between nature and society, natural and artificial, and urban, rural indeed. And obviously it has been done many times, and all the excellent projects on city scales we are seeing are always seen from the very broad perspective, and we have incredible legacy through Ian McHarg and his design with nature, and some of his statements that didn't make very happy some of his colleagues, like that science is the only defensible authority for landscape design. But what he really combined is ecology through not only an explanation of actions we should do on urban and regional scale, but also a command. And he combines ecology as the science, a way of describing the world, a cause, and an aesthetic. And why I'm pointing it out, because, well, the importance of scientific understanding of territory as an organic, complex, multi-scale, multi-dimensional system in constant transition is incredibly important today, because this transition goes in acceleration, and this is the only way to understand it. And if we simplify the future scenarios through some more emotional than scientific attitudes, well, it can really make difficult to understand the true dimension of the ecological crisis we are in today. So the ecological complexity and its understanding is actually the starting point for any project we are dealing with. And we can see the different models, ecological models, that are not contradictory, nevertheless very different, like, for example, Felix Guattari's 3 ecologies of environment, of social relations, mental, as he calls it, and human subjectivity, and we can overlap it to a more geomorphological view of ecology taught to us all from Professor Formans in his landscape ecology, and reading the territory through patches, corridors, and matrix, where patches can be both natural and also artificial, like cities, natural, like lakes, for example, corridors, again, natural, like rivers, or artificial, like, well, railways, highways, and the matrices that are not having only the presence of material presence, but also organizational role. And well, these overlapping or complementary reading of different ecological models can give us an opportunity to understand territory holistically. And without going further in the introduction, I would like to show you the example of Lugano, my city in south of Switzerland, that, well, its development is definitely preconditioned by its geomorphological and territorial, demographic and economic infrastructural characteristics. It is placed in the south and part of Switzerland, and connects the axis of connection between the well, Italy and northern Switzerland, and the close proximity of Milan, which you can see in this image. It's really very evident, and evident the urban continuity from the very center of Milan to the area of Lugano and other small cities that are creating a completely polycentric structure that can be seen as a confluence between different constellations and the existing very strong urban centers. But why it is important to analyze this kind of contributions of different systems that the geography of new centralities in Lugano case is showing, it is because we have to understand and see the possibility of unbuilt space and its value as strong as the need to recycle, rethink the built environment. So the territorial model that could be seen here, composed by built and unbuilt elements, is showing that we can reformulate the natural space in a way of a regional park, or Parco dei Laghi, as we would call it in Italian, and see the real value, but defining the natural spaces, defining them as we do it with built spaces, in terms of recycling the obsolete industrial, for example, elements, but we can also think about recycling the agricultural models thanks to the new technologies we can use today. But the definition of intermediate and in-between space is extremely important. Otherwise, this stain of spontaneous urbanization can cover actually all the spaces that are precious for the environmental quality of the Lugano landscape and geomorphology, and could improve and tackle, by protecting them, tackle the questions with climate change that we are facing, but also maintain its characteristics and the beauty. So if we understand this local, the combination of local characteristics and global notion of the city, we can really have a new archipelago model composed with different elements. And yes, so those are three main points I wanted to underline, that it's very important to understand ecological complexity of the area we are dealing with, to understand the value of natural non-built in-between space, and understand the territory seen holistically as constantly changing, and all design decisions, our design decisions, have to be permanently questioned and reinvented. And to close it, I like to quote here Denis Gabor, who said that the future cannot be predicted, but futures can be invented. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and over to you, Benjamin and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you kept to time. That's wonderful. I appreciated some of the points. I think the importance of the in-between space really came out there. You know, like you said, the ecological complexity and value of those in-between spaces, especially in our urban environments. So that's fantastic. And that moves nicely on to Anna, who will be presenting next. And she's an architect, urbanist, and musician based in Geneva. I think that's a wonderful way of having an introduction. And she'll be presenting on the co-regeneration of Earth and a kind of a view from the margins. So Anna, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. And I'd just like to know if you can see my screen. Is it full screen? Benjamin, can you just confirm?
Yep, it's working perfectly.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you, Stanislava, for this excellent introduction and all your wonderful references. So we're going to look sort of beyond the coronavirus also, is to sort of think about what this has brought us. And some people are saying there will be a BC and AC, before Corona, after Corona. And one thing we do know is that there is no planet B. So I'm going to use this B as a sort of framework to see how are we going to go beyond. We talk a lot about the Anthropocene and the effect of man on Earth, and how are we going to go beyond that? And it's also about doing more now, not just it's going beyond the passive, but being more active in our actions, and going from the ego to the eco, where man is not at the top of the pyramid as in the Anthropocene, but really integrated with species. And these are some of the themes that I will be talking about. It's obviously talking about the metabolism of cities rather than the linear systems, and also landscape urbanism. And I'm glad to hear that landscape urbanism will also be integrated into the construction declares. So these reports are very important because of the effect of climate change on land, and what we are doing on the land, how it affects the climate, as well as the loss of biodiversity. So we heard about Lugano in Switzerland, and I just wanted to mention that at the moment we have some climate activists occupying our most symbolic public space in Bern, the capital of Switzerland. And so this is really important because these are youth, as you see, respecting the hygiene measures, but really who want accountability. So using the public space to talk about the climate. And we also have a judgment going on right now in the courts about these climate activists who took over a bank to have a tennis match. And they were talking about how the banks are funding the fossil fuel industries. And Federer, who is being funded by UBS, so they were sort of challenging, taking up the private space, but to have a public match. And so it's also questioning not just nations, the SDGs, the UN, but also the infrastructure, the superstructure, which are the corporations and the banks. And so you see a very passive putting a tree in front of an entrance, blocking the entrance with a tree, making this link between the bank, the investment, and the climate change and the effect it has on the trees. So this is Geneva. This is also the UN. So they're now integrating biodiversity in the UN, having these sheep grazing instead of using lawnmowers. We now have a woman at the head of the UN. So it's really about a co-creation as well with animals. So there are more and more teachings and workshops around this. So this is something I did with my students. So it was to bring the hawksbill turtle, an endangered species in Qatar, at the forefront as a public species, using also public art, public space. Here we're using a public art installation of a turtle in the university, and then doing something on National Day with kids. And why are we doing this? It's also because we have to raise awareness, but also through designing pavilions, and also doing a master plan with our students in masters for an eco beach for turtle conservation. So it's really using all the different media to design for these endangered species. So biomes, why are biomes important? We had the MERS in the Middle East, and we now know that there's this really a link between the healthy gut, the healthy soil ecosystem, so that our fight against pandemics is not just going to be with vaccines and social distancing, but also in the health of our soil ecosystem and the health of our gut. So there's a lot of literature now which is looking at this relationship. So it's really important as urbanists, landscape urbanist architects, is the soil. It's something that I feel has been really understudied and underconsidered by architects and urbanists. And so this was an event we did where we were looking at landscape as infrastructure for biodiversity and food security. So also always linking the biodiversity and the food security. This is a composting bin we brought to the university because there's no composting in the university in Qatar or in Qatar at all. So the idea was then to create a living laboratory at the university for the food, water, energy nexus. So saying this university becomes a living laboratory where we involve all the stakeholders in the research, those who are actually, designing the university, who are managing, administrating, all the communities, where even the migrant workers. And we took an urban farm and looked at what they were doing to sort of bring that model to the university. This is a young Qatari farmer who's working with indigenous Qatari system, with indigenous plants, but also with the latest technologies, and has a permaculture approach. So we were collaborating with them to try and redesign the university and to bring in all this sort of systems thinking, nature-based systems into the university, also creating obviously the biodiversity hotspots. And the proposal was to make food forests, because this idea is having the biodiversity and the food, creating shade, using water. This is actually before and after, how you can use water with very little water to create these very vibrant ecosystems. So here we're visiting the university. We brought in a soil specialist for a workshop that I was funded from Chicago, and we actually built a huge composting heap on the campus. And this is with our students. You can see the Nepali workers, the Filipino maids, we can see the gardeners, the architects. There's also kids from school. So involving everybody in planting this permaculture food garden that we created at the university. This is our Egyptian landscape gardener, the Nepali gardeners. We're bringing in also all that knowledge. This was actually, we actually designed this with the students. We did soil analysis, climate analysis, and then planted an edible garden based on actually case studies of a permaculture garden that was installed in a compound house in Qatar. So we had really evidence-based that we could grow all of these. Why do I talk about Beuys? Because he was an artist in the 1950s, 60s in Berlin, and he did a work on coyote. This is a coyote that we saw in San Francisco during COVID. He did a performance in 1974, but why was he important? Because he was actually one of the founders of the Green political party in Germany. And so I think it's really important to see how artists and activists are always at the forefront of making change in our society. And he also reminds me of Herbert Sukop, who was confined in Berlin in the 1970s. And because he couldn't study the environment around Berlin, he started to look at the environment within the city. And that's how urban ecology was born. So I work on borders, and it was interesting. I was in Berlin when the wall fell, and it was interesting to see the whole of Europe, all of a sudden the borders closing again during COVID. It was very unexpected to see cities even being locked down, and to see all this spatial distancing, or what we call social distancing, and also what happens, when there's no more activity. This is a highway being washed over by sand dunes, animals coming into the city center that we found. So the city is becoming these huge buffer zones where the rewilding of the urban, and also looking at the 5 Bs, which is, these are essential to biodiversity, and how we're also looking now, how do we actually design with and for these endangered species. I saw actually all of these butterflies dying in Tatasan because there's a lot of pesticides being used in agriculture. So we really have to co-create, and this is a project by Terraform where they're actually making a facade for butterflies. Berlin, this was a project I did in 1990 for the Berlin Wall to create a sort of ecological corridor with water. And so a few areas were kept as parks for biodiversity, but there was one huge project which was actually born from activists and nature lovers to create a green belt in the whole of the European Union. And it was the biggest study of biodiversity that was done in Germany. So I've also worked on Cyprus in the buffer zone, this in-between space. So redesigning the buffer zone for the food, water, energy, waste nexus. So how do we look at these spaces? This is what we did with our students to redesign the infrastructure. And I'm doing similar work also in Korea. So this is very large scale, but looking at how do we design these in-between spaces for the future, addressing the future threats. So these are some of the publications and workshops that we've done. And these are similar projects, but much smaller scale that were that we actually built in Boston. There's a very small community garden built with the community in underserved spaces of the city. And in Qatar, this is looking at the crisis and opportunity, because it was really during Qatar, during the blockade in 2017, it was in a way something that prepared Qatar for the COVID, because it was really having to resource all the food, to rethink about diets, to rethink about food. And we had already been preparing this work with our students. And finally, the blue is, what is the blue? It's about giving back more to nature. So I have a publication, you can read more about this, but the idea is it's water-based, but it's also about going beyond the green and giving back more. And also it's a bottoms-up approach. So we based this on the High Line, but we created a sort of Friends of Abu Nakla, and we were trying to save this wetland, bringing the projects to the Public Works, to the Minister of Urban Planning. So it's also empowering the students to actually look at what needs to be done and to bring the projects to the authorities. So we're also redesigning the Corniche in a more ecological belt using saline agriculture, creating food forests in the city using treated sewage effluent, and also creating mangroves for climate change. This last project is, I was a technical reviewer, so this is bioremediation in Tatarstan. This was a public space program, but which also is using bioremediation to clean the water. And this is also being rolled out in the whole of Tatarstan, even in the village. So you can see the way they change from channelizing villages to using more nature-based solution. And what's wonderful is this is actually a willow tree, which was cut down by mistake, created a whole participatory process because there was an uproar about this willow tree. All these public space projects were done with participation. And Putin came to see this project, and now it's actually being made mandatory in the whole of Russia. So this project has had an impact in the whole of Russia and was awarded the Aga Khan Award. Finally, I will stop. This was the balconies. I started to look at balconies in a different way. I was performing on my balcony during COVID, looking at how balconies were constructed. This is actually my street with all the people who could see the balconies and how we were engaging. And so how this, the balconies proxemics, how we're starting to look at this social, the relationships in different ways. So I'll finish just with the S, we mentioned the superdisciplinarity, and this was the head of the EU Science Foundation speaking at Davos, and he's also a musician, and I liked his concept of the superdisciplinarity. It's really flying beyond the walls and borders of disciplinary, the symbiocene, going beyond the Anthropocene, so more about symbiosis with nature, nature-based solutions, smaller infrastructure, small is beautiful, smart citizens versus smart cities, and also more feminine-based approaches to urban design. And I think I will end here because I think I've probably overstepped my time, Benjamin. So I will finish on the more gender equality and women in the future planning.
No problem. Thanks very much. So yeah, I'm taking a few key points from that. There is no planet B. I think that resonates with everyone, that, unless we can develop the enterprise or something like that in a short space of time, yep, there is no planet B. And how we move beyond the Anthropocene and to the symbiocene, from ego to eco. I think that I really picked up on that. And touching on the UN SDGs, the Club de Juristes, pardon my French, is quite poor, but they actually highlighted that the SDGs are basically advancing the human-centric approach to the Anthropocene, and actually systemically part of the Earth system destruction that they set out boldly to prevent. And so, seeing nature as the infrastructure and that position of with nature as an equal rather than above was quite interesting. And finally, the resilience as a bottom-up approach, even in places which you highlighted are actually quite typically very top-down. So the fact that a bottom-up approach, when done right, we have a role to play and we can do that. So without further ado, I'll move on to John. So John is a writer, a engineer designer and a urban rural curator. He's published a book recently on how to thrive in the next economy, designing tomorrow's world today, and it's just being published. So over to you, John, on your title, Biodiversity, a Wicked Opportunity.
Thank you, and I'm not showing slides, so I can't compete with Anna and the previous presentation of their wonderful projects, but in a funny way, the sheer bounty and the number of those projects, which I've just learned about in many cases for the first time, is at the center of what I want to say today, which is biodiversity is already happening at a global scale in cities as well as outside them. And that in terms of the kind of discussions that one often sees in the media about, firstly, how terrible everything is, that we've had these big reports just this week about, you know, the catastrophic decline in living systems around the world, combined with these large global bodies such as the United Nations having these multi-year discussions in which large numbers of very well-intentioned and expert scientists and policymakers meet for years and years in dreadful convention centers, publish immensely thick books, and it's really a recipe for feeling despair that if you look at what the media says about biodiversity as a subject and as an opportunity for us, it's a pretty bad picture. And this year it's going to be bigger than normal in terms of global activity because all the countries of the world are heading towards some kind of convention in which they're going to talk about expanding what they call the protected areas of the world, that is to say massive areas of nature kept free of the kind of pollution of man and man's activities, which has a certain logic to it, but there's already a sense that maybe this is an old-fashioned way to think about life on Earth, and that maybe what we're really looking at is ways to enhance and help to thrive the many, many things of a positive nature that are already happening. And that's why I said about what we heard just from the other two speakers, incredible variety of experiments, but also just practical activities on the ground. So I said in the poster that I was going to describe biodiversity as a wicked opportunity. I use the word opportunity because it's not a problem, it's actually an opportunity to look at and connect with things that are happening which are positive, but it's wicked because it's complicated. There's this incredible number of people involved in different ways, many, many disciplines. I've learned a new word, superdisciplinary. Yeah, biodiversity by definition is superdisciplinary, whether or not you're a human being or a bug or a bacterium. So you have this kind of definition of something which is hard for policymakers and maybe for architects and designers and city planners to deal with, namely something complicated, perpetually changing, not easy to define, not easy to provide metrics. But I just start from the point of view of let's begin where the positive action is happening. What can we do to help the positive things thrive? And I'm talking about everything from urban farming, daylighting rivers, the whole subject of connecting where clothes from with where the fibers are grown, 1,000,001 food projects all over the world. And to me, the kind of opportunity is not so much to try and imagine things that people can do, but to look for ways to connect them to each other. And I think that we heard already this notion of blue-green corridors, for example, that there is a notion of connecting things to each other, which is in nature and ecology, what they do very often. It's not so much planting an ecosystem, it's connecting maybe very tiny patches together. And so you have this phenomenon in cities of parklets. Little parks could be no bigger than a bucket with a few seeds in it, or something bigger and more formal. I just give you an example from Pittsburgh, which is rather inspiring to me. The city has identified 45,000 vacant lots, little bits of abandoned or damaged land, and has said to the citizens, yeah, come along and bring this lot back to life with a garden, with a plant, with a forest, with a parklet, and then do it together and begin to connect them together. And this leads on to this phenomenon called relational ecology, which is what begins to just unite all these different activities to each other. So in terms of what can an architect or an engineer or a planner do, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, I'm sure, I think that identifying what is already happening is firstly a desirable activity, and secondly, it'll make you feel very positive at an early stage in your next steps. Look at ways of connecting with projects that are already happening and saying, hey, do you feel that you need some help from a designer, from an architect, from a planner? How can we help you do your project better? And I guess, because I think we should get into the discussion, just to give you an example of why this is so powerful, go and look for what's already happening. I did a biennial in France a few years ago in which I said, we must look at the daylighting of the river, bringing the river back to life. And it's all, and the architects and the planners and the mayor all said, oh no, it's too hard. We concreted over the river years ago. And then at the end of our first meeting, a young woman came up to me afterwards and said, can I just show you my kind of archive? And she showed me a collection of photographs and documents and films and interviews with people around the region who were at that moment doing projects to bring little bits of the river back to life. Everything from wild garlic plants to a map of picnic sites, a whole group looking at talking to farmers to stop them polluting little bits of the river. 45 projects were documented by this woman. And we made those the center of the biennial. And then the city officials and the politicians and the policymakers came along and said, where did you get all these projects? We never heard of all these things before. That's in one city of France. And I absolutely promise you that can be found all over the world. We need to go out and connect with things that are already happening and use our multiplicity of skills and capabilities to help them do better, which is why I hope we can discuss this in a positive sense. And to conclude, there is a kind of business opportunity, and I talked to Richard from Roja about this recently. We need a professional platform design activity to help integrate all these activities. Maybe we can come onto that in the discussion. But it's not just letting 1,000 flowers bloom, it's also helping the flowers talk to each other. And that, I think, is a gigantic opportunity for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. That's absolutely wonderful. And it does lead us nicely into the discussion, which we'll be having. All those participating, please do key in any questions that you might have in the question and answer box below, so we can enjoy answering those. I thought it was really nice to end on a presentation which looks at the positives, things that are already happening, practical activities, and also kind of thinking of, it is complex, acknowledging the complexity, but looking at how do we break it down into smaller, more bite-sized pieces so that collectively the action is greater than the sum of the parts, and that really helps get over that inertia. So that's a lovely place to start our discussion. So if everyone could turn their cameras back on, we can kind of get into it. And I think this, given that the title is Construction Declares, and we're talking about the non-construction, is something that's really important and wonderful, because quite often we push the natural environment to a lower level, or something as an afterthought, or something that's there, and we forget about the natural capital, or talk about it as a piece of infrastructure, or even beyond infrastructure. So I think this is something which I think we can really drill down on a little bit more. And when we talk about cities, we tend to talk about the buildings or the urban design, but we do forget about the disturbance to the out of sight natural environments which are used for mining the products which could flow into the cities, the agriculture, and those big kind of meta systems of globalization that kind of are metabolized in our urban environments. So I'll start off by, as a policymaker myself, I have to ask a policy-based question. And addressing the topic of in-between spaces, you know, as a policymaker, or what do you see, or what have you seen as being successful or necessary policies which will help increase the commons for ecosystem health? Perhaps Anne could start us off on this one.
Thank you very much for this question. It's a big question. Maybe I'll take it from the larger system, because I think one of the things when we talk about the in-between or the commons, I mentioned blue urbanism, and I think one of the factors of blue urbanism is, in fact, Sylvia Earle said the world is blue. So in fact, we have all this in-between, which is the ocean, we could say, and which we are actually not really considering in all of our urbanization. And we know that, in fact, the health of the planet is based on the health of the ocean. And many things that we are doing on land in urbanization, you know, the water, the plastics, etc., is having a huge effect on land, which is on the sea, on the ocean. So I think that's looking very largely at the commons and this space. So I think that's really important, is to have more of the relationship between the land and the sea and what we're doing. And actually, because a majority of cities are actually, you know, built on the coastline. So I think this idea of the blue urbanism and this interface and the effects of everything that we are doing, the effects it's having on the sea and not just on the land. I think there needs to be more consideration, planning and policy around that, and more accountability around that. Then the intermediate, the commons, I think it's really important to look at any kind of space as a commons and as a space of co-creation with the different communities. And so it's really addressing different communities as much as the space, because sometimes the in-between space is spatial, but it's also where different people are moving and different communities. So it's not necessarily always a kind of a fixed space. I think in the case of borders, then it's where I'm interested in, is areas which have been outside of development. So it can be borders, but it can be any kind of, in French, you say les friches industrielles, or places that have been taken out of development for a while. And so I think it's really important when we're planning is to have policies that give us time to really have the right kind of project, because sometimes, as you were saying, the forces of real estate will go much faster than the forces, you know, the ecology doesn't have the same power and force. And so we need to have policies and mechanisms so that we have the time to make the right projects and to co-create the right projects. So which means to create them also with the communities that need them. And so I think it's also about you know, serving the underserved communities, serving the fragile communities as well with these in-between spaces.
Stanislava, what about you?
Yeah, well, I show a few slides just dedicated to in-between space, and what I would like is just to underline that the most important in thinking about those places is not as a residual spaces, but really as a decisive qualitatively for the systems, urban systems we are thinking of. And regarding the projects that could be done, and it is very important to define them, because otherwise what will happen is this spontaneous stain just spreading and taking our natural spaces, and this is not the way we can't allow ourselves this kind of development. So defining them in different ways, like, well, spaces for renewable energy. This is something in case of Lugano that could be very well done. Then the new ways of agriculture. This is something that also can be developed on a local and a regional scale. And also giving the new real and virtual connections, we can actually make those places transform them in a new ways of even from the economic point of view of use, but without using the land, but just rethinking them as a part of a mosaic, but never just a residual, but importantly interstitial, but as the real structure of of whole system.
Okay, anything you wish to add, John, given the nature of your discussion?
Yes, I think that the policymakers have a tremendous opportunity to help create what I like to call social infrastructure. Governments all over the world are saying we must do something to recover from COVID and bring the economy back to life. And there's a kind of default to say we must build things out of concrete. That's what they did in the past. I think that we've all been talking about patches, about edge projects, about small things that have quality but are kind of maybe isolated. The whole subject of how you coordinate between these different activities and projects requires, you know, the coordination. The relational ecology is an activity that needs to be supported. And that is a form of social infrastructure which can create a lot of work, jobs, sometimes, certainly activities. And there are all sorts of ideas out there about how this connecting together can be done. But that's something which policy can do right now without vast expenditure, which I think is another advantage. So for example, it costs probably 500 times more to build a dam per square meter than it does to de-pave a car park and put an urban garden in it. So, but the urban garden requires, as we've heard from the other two, different disciplines. So social infrastructure would be my vote.
Okay. I'm going to take a question that's popped up on the question answer box, which was one of the questions that I was looking forward to asking as well, which is how can we as architects, urban designers, planners, landscape designers, architects, etc., empower our voice is the word used there. But, you know, I would say, what can we do in our practices today, or, you know, or even tomorrow on projects to really bring the issue of green infrastructure to the forefront in our projects?
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll start with John on this one, because you actually had.
I feel quite. I mean, I work with a lot of architects and designers, obviously, as a curator, and I always say pretty much the same thing: is don't think very hard in your studio about what you can do. Go and find somebody outside your studio, in the city, in the region, in nature, that's doing work, and have a conversation with them about other ways in which a design expertise or planning or architecture could help you do your job better. Don't make any expectations about knowing what the answer is, but start the conversations. That's my very strong advice. And it's always fun. You always learn stuff. You always get to meet new people. So yeah, it's a very kind of, I think that's an easy starting point.
I think that's good advice. I think maybe Anne can also add on from some of the projects she highlighted. You know, perhaps.
Yes. Thank you. I'd be happy to. Yes, my experience was actually, you know, talking to the engineers. So in Qatar, I used to go to the drainage conference. I was actually the chairperson, which might seem a bit strange, but that's how I got to know all the water engineers working on water, and we invited them to come and talk to our students. And we actually designed real, you know, projects based on the water infrastructure and the future water systems, which we then brought, you know, we tried to lobby and bring to the decision makers. So I think it is about trying to find the opportunities. And then also with the NGOs, there was an NGO, Friends of Nature, in Qatar. So we were also talking to them, and they had certain influence. So it's really, I think, you know, creating, as you were saying, John, you know, this kind of the relational ecology, like the relationships, and talking to the engineers, talking to the nature specialists, and creating this collective sort of creation. In a way, we create the projects together with the students, and also empowering. I think for me, it was important to empower the students, because they're the next generation. So to empower them to take up these challenges and to learn. I think it's also the language and the conversation, learning to talk to the engineers, learning, really creating a conversation.
Okay, I'm actually going to change the topic a little bit for Stanislava and kind of go, is it actually a question of value? How we value things, or how do we shift the market to place a value on natural systems, you know, especially for those kind of undeveloped spaces within cities or urban areas? Do you think that that's a hindrance or an opportunity, or are there any examples where we're really valuing those spaces in the market well?
Well, yes, of course there is value, but value is not always material. There is also cultural value, contextual value, geographical, not directly intermediate. We can, well, our profession is by definition projection, so the value is not always tactable at the moment, but very, very important for well, memory even of the space. And this is why the rereading our urban system is so important in thinking all types of value we can in learning value and also educating value in the future. And here I agree, just a little bit going back to the previous question with Anna, how important is also develop and empowering young generations and students in understanding this, because effectively they are the real value of the space. Because what is the city but the people? I mean, Shakespeare defined it perfectly. So this is another value.
Mm. Yeah, no, I would tend to agree. It's just the number of times you run into issues with, well, I'm going to take down this tree on my site because it's easier to build my building there with it cleared, and then I'll put some trees back afterwards. Whereas looking at if the tree actually had a value to it, we could say, well, actually, now the market has to recognize that that tree is worth $1 million. So now that tree is worth $1 million, Mr. Developer, Mr. Architect, Mr. Engineer, maybe you want to consider how you now approach that project, how you approach that site. And I think that it kind of, again, bringing that ego to eco, it kind of bringing it to the same kind of level, because unfortunately, in many cases, I'm sure many of the audience out there working on projects will have that debate with both clients, and those working in policy will have those debates with some higher ups in the policies when we talk about the intangible values of slack spaces, of parks, which may not even be visited by people, but provide that visual relief. There's a question which has also popped up on the Q&A, which I think I'll send to John first, which is, what are the factors hindering biodiversity in cities? So what do you think are the key factors there?
I read that question. I think that's from Jude.
Yeah.
The factors are history. There is an argument that our separation from nature goes back 500 years, or that it goes back longer than just the industrial period. So that's a gigantic subject. Like always, I prefer to say that was the reason we were separated from nature in our minds as well as in our cities. That is changing. And the millions of examples, literally millions of examples in which people are reconnecting with living things are where I think we should start. And that's why I actually think that celebrating the positive activities that are happening is a good place for many, many different disciplines. Policymakers live a horribly isolated and frustrating life. Anything you can do to get a policymaker out of a convention center and into a forest, into a garden, into a parklet will be a happy-making experience for that policymaker in two ways. A, personally, but also they will realize it's not their job to create everything out of nothing. That's why there's no sort of social harvest festivals or ecological festivals where you get all the different projects from a city together in a shed with some food and beer and say, look, it's already happening, let's talk to each other. That, I think, is one of the most powerful ways of just making movement happen, just getting people together in a very simple way. And we can all do that. We can all provide a shed and some beer and a few kind of contacts. So I think we should do that.
Okay. May I say something? Yeah, thank you. I'd like to just mention something, and John, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're also seeing interesting things that because of in the countryside, there's such a use of pesticides in farming mainly, we're often seeing for things like bees, for example, that they're healthier in the cities. Now, more and more people are having hives in the cities. And because there are no pesticides, so we're seeing interesting things. And until we, we kind of regenerate our agriculture in the rural areas, we'll have some interesting sort of things happening in the cities where maybe some species are actually happier nearer cities than in the countryside.
No, if I could just note, there are various studies, and they're growing in number. There is much more biodiversity in most cities than in most of the agricultural kind of managed land outside. And this is completely against this whole UN global top-down thinking, which is we must have bigger national parks somewhere else where people can't go, but actually in the messy kind of waste-filled cities of the world. So the two cities with the highest amount of bird life in terms of biodiversity are Delhi and Nairobi, which are regarded normally as rather kind of dysfunctional cities. If we change the thing saying how much biodiversity is there in your city, then Delhi and Nairobi go to the top of the list. So that's, we can achieve a lot by just changing the way we measure things.
Yes, and I think you brought up also something really important is the whole question of the urban and rural, because we're always talking about UN Habitat, it's all about cities, and we're all going to be living in cities. And I think we really need to change that lens and to say we've got to really look at the rural areas and what are we doing with the rural areas, keep people from migrating to urban areas, and rethink the rural. And I think there's some interesting things going on right now about Rem Koolhaas has just had a big exhibition about rural areas. There was also a Biennale in China talking about. So I think it's really important. And Benjamin, you were actually also saying something interesting I didn't know about the Club des Juristes and the SDGs. And I think we really need to really have, for the future, rethink all of this.
That's absolutely wonderful. Conscious of time, and I think this is a wonderful segue into Richard coming on. But before that, a little summary that I've gleaned from that conversation. So we focus on land a lot, but actually, the sea. We are a blue planet after all, predominantly. So we need to look at those blue spaces and not think of them as distinct and separate, but integrated into our policies and also our accountability. There's a tremendous space for co-creation. So as architects, as engineers, landscape architects, look for people already getting their hands into the soil, who've already come up with these solutions, already doing it, learn from them, and kind of bring that together cohesively. And I think the kind of the idea of that we are separate from nature is something which it's still ingrained in us. And then finally, I like to use the term reurbanization, something which a local architect or saltwater, Tay Keng Soon, actually had as his meta-narrative for a long time in Singapore, that we need to urbanize the rural and ruralize the urban. So it kind of allows for these things to take place. But I think now it's time for Richard from WOHA, who, if you don't know them, their architectural practice is known for the bringing in of nature and blending it together with their construction in a way which is a fantastic contemporary vernacular for the urban tropics. So Richard, I'll leave it to you to close the session. Thank you very much. And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, fascinating. Always too short, I think. We should maybe think about making it a little longer, the session in future. But a great second session with Stanislava, I think, learning about, I guess, different ways of looking at ecologies, and then thinking how that can be broadened to different ecologies. Actually, all three today really brought. I've been reading a bit of Gregory Bateson lately, who's I would call him a super disciplinary thinker for sure, one of the originators of system thinking, but an anthropologist, a psychologist, into cybernetics, and I think we really need more of that kind of thinking. He was doing it in the 60s and 70s, but really such a need now to start pulling models of thinking from one discipline to another, connecting disciplines. And as John said, a wicked opportunity. It is really hard because I think all our childhood we're brought up to separate things into silos and different disciplines and focus on them. And what I sort of feel like we need to start doing is really looking at, rather than figure and ground, you know, that we see some things as figure and other things as ground. So I think traditionally the city was the figure and the outside the city was ground, but actually both of these things are important. So to start thinking about patterns maybe rather than objects and elements. And I think you can start judging the health of things by the patterns they make. And I think that sort of led nicely to me thinking about our last session with Namal and his idea of tracking social capital, economic capital, and environmental capital. I think if we had measures of all these three things that were simultaneously tracked, and we could see when one was being premiated at the expense of another, it could be, you know, a very simple indicator for governments and policy to say we've gone way too far in one direction and the other two are suffering. So for me, I'm full of ideas from hearing about all of you. So I think it's been fantastic. Looking forward to the next one, Ben. And I hope everyone who tuned in comes along next time and we grow our audience, because I think this session itself is an example, I think, of John's connecting people up, I think, and learning about what's out there. And that systems thinking where the sum of the parts is much greater than the individual components. So I'm feeling very happy about it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hussein, do you want to declare the session closed, or are we done?
Yeah, yes, I declare the session closed. Thank you very much for everyone. It's a fantastic session, and I look forward to more engagements in our future events. Thank you, Ben, John, Anna, Stanislava, and Richard as well, who is obviously a proponent of this whole movement in Singapore. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day ahead. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, everyone.